Okay. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening from wherever you are joining. A very warm welcome to everyone. I can see that right now we have more than 85 attendees, so we have more than 100 people in the room. Very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Doreen Odongo, proudly Kenyan and proudly working with Award, African Women in Agricultural Research and Development, Award. Award is based in Nairobi, Kenya, hosted by the World Agroforestry, and you will get to hear more about it if you still don't know about Award, but I'm sure everybody who is joining us today is very familiar with Award, and I'm honored and delighted to be the moderator for the session today. So before we start, I would like to make a few announcements. The first announcement, kindly rename yourself. Just click on the 3 little dots. If you hover on your profile or on your video, you will see some 3 little dots next to menu, and fields on rename. Kindly click that and rename yourself. Also, kindly use the chat function to tell us where you're joining us from. Today, we are particularly very delighted to have both cohorts of the fellows in the Gender Responsive Agriculture Systems Policy Fellowship, the GRASP Fellowship. We are very happy to have participants from both cohorts joining us. So this is an opportunity to connect with each other. Kindly tell us who you are, where you're joining us from. If you could also tell us which cohort you're in, it will give you an opportunity to know whom you should connect with, both now and as you go on. The third announcement I would like to make is that we are recording this session, so please be aware and informed that we are recording this event today. And then finally, we have language support services. Interpretation services are available in French and in English. We are aware that we have French-speaking participants as well as English-speaking participants. And for that purpose, do feel free to choose the language of your preference. At the bottom, when you click on more, you should be able to see the button on interpretation. Kindly click on that and select the language of your choice. Because of that, I'm going to request all the speakers when they come on board to kindly speak slowly to enable our interpreters to provide us with language interpretation seamlessly. Option for renaming names is disabled. I can see your chats. My colleagues will be responding to your chats. My colleagues will be monitoring and responding to your chats as we continue. All right, I think that's about all the announcements for now, but please feel free to post anything in the chat. If you have a question and you'd like some assistance in any way, we have my colleagues from Award monitoring the chats and will be responding to you. Now, we are here today as the community in the Gender Responsive Agriculture Systems Policy Fellow, particularly learn more about a very important and innovative tool that has been designed by our colleagues and partners in the International Food Policy Research Institute, that is the Women's Empowerment in Agrifood Governance Measurement Tool. I don't know whether to call it WEAGov or WEAGov, but we have some 2 experts who will tell us more about the framework, about the tool. And so we are truly honored to have two experts today who will talk more about it. So really the focus of today's webinar is about that tool. But before that, we want to hear some opening remarks from the Director of Award, Dr. Susan Karia, who will give us an overview of Award and generally of the GRASP Fellowship, and in particular, why this session is important in the context of what we are doing in the fellowship. Why are we having this particular event? So without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Susan Karia to give us her opening remarks. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Doreen, and a warm welcome to everyone who is joining. I see the numbers are going up. And I'm very, very excited to have you all and to welcome you all to this event. A warm welcome to our policy fellows, a warm welcome to their mentors, a warm welcome to the emerging policy professionals to this event, and a warm welcome to our friends at Drs. Jordan Kyle and Drs. Catherine Ragaza. So very briefly, what I would like to let you know is award was established in 2008 as a career development fellowship program with the aim of building a pool of confident, capable, and capable leaders, women leaders who would be leading and playing a leadership role in the agriculture research for development sector in Africa. And we were responding to the underrepresentation of African women in leadership positions in this sector. We started off working at the individual level, but we quickly realized that we also needed to work at the institutional level, engaging with institutions so that they can integrate gender in their policies and practices. And then we also work at the enabling environment level, where we are really trying to influence the policy environment space. And the GRASP Fellowship allows us to intervene at the enabling environment space. So let me tell you a little bit about this fellowship program. It's funded by USAID and really aims to build a pool of African women in leadership, in policy design and change, so that we can influence and improve agri-food systems in Africa. The fellowship keeps award, as I said, contributing to the enabling environment and the policy environment, but also to build a body of knowledge on gender and agri-food systems, and finally, to leverage ongoing discussions and initiatives on transforming food systems in Africa to make those systems much more inclusive. The target of the fellowship, we are targeting 100 policy fellows, and they work with 100 senior policy experts who also, and together they also work with 100, initially we called them junior policy professionals, but we have been encouraged to use emerging policy professionals. And the three work together to really generate innovative policy responses to very complex socioeconomic challenges that are facing smallholder farmers in Africa. Next week, so at the moment, we have our 100 policy fellows, we have our 100 senior policy experts, and next week, we are going to welcome the first cohort of 50 emerging policy practitioners, where we have an event where we are hosting them as they start their work on June 27th. This fellowship is focusing on 12 countries. The first cohort is from Malawi, Nigeria, Zambia, Uganda, Kenya, and Ghana. And the second cohort is from Mozambique, Madagascar, Ethiopia, Senegal, Burkina Faso, and Rwanda. So while the policy fellows are our main beneficiaries of the GRASP Fellowship, the full success really hinges on the three working together: the policy fellow, the senior policy expert, and the emerging policy practitioner. And the idea is to have them work together and develop solutions that can address gender gaps in our policy environments, in agri-food systems. What we do is we build the skills of the policy fellows in terms of mentoring, leadership, but also short courses. So we have a course on gender in agriculture policies, a course around negotiation skills, advocacy, and lots of peer-to-peer learning sessions, so that there's lots of information sharing. And of course, we have master classes on very topical themes that also are designed to build the skills of the policy fellows. The fellowship also builds the capacity of policy fellows to identify key policy priorities and entry points for transformative change and also skills on how to advocate and contribute to gender-responsive agri-food systems policy environments in Africa. A key component of it is what we call the policy innovation projects, where each of our GRAS policy fellows gets to develop. And the aim of the policy innovation project is to address a very specific gender gap within a policy. So then they identify the policy, and then they identify the policy gap, and then they go ahead and address that. We provide the policy fellows with what we call a catalytic fund that helps them to initiate the process, but we also support them to look for resources, bigger resources that can help them actually make meaningful policy interventions. To support the policy fellows in implementing those policy innovation projects, we provide practical guidance, we share tools, we share techniques, we share methods, and we've shared different tools. So for example, many of the policy fellows were introduced to a tool developed by FAO called the Gender in Agriculture Policy Analysis tool that they've been using to analyze and assess gender equality gaps in the policies and to identify entry points. I envision that the WEAGov, the Women's Empowerment in Agri-Food Governance assessment tool, is one such important tool that we hope that you will all find useful. I should also mention that the policy innovation projects are from across all themes in agri-food systems. You find them in seed systems, access to credit, aquaculture, fisheries, food safety, agroecology, digitalization, etc., all across. And the policy innovation projects also span the entire policy cycle. So there are some that focusing on policy gender gap identification, others are generating evidence, others are disseminating findings, others are bringing policy practitioners together and advocating for the integration of gender. So they are really quite diverse, and it just depends on where the policy fellow is coming from. So the webinar today's webinar is going to introduce the Women's Empowerment in Agri-Food Governance. And it's a tool that was developed, I'm very happy, by IFPRI, and they are here today to share that. And my hope is that this will really help you to identify gaps and opportunities for empowering women across the national policy cycle, and to really identify specific entry points that can be used, but also to monitor progress in terms of women's empowerment in agri-food systems. At the end of the program, what we hope and what we expect to see from the policy fellows is enhanced networking and links across the policy cycle, improved ability to recognize and respond to the policy issues in your countries, around the region, around Africa, but also strengthen capacity to influence policy. And before I close, let me close with one example of how the work you're doing is actually contributing to important regional processes and really making a difference in ongoing discussions and in initiatives on transforming agri-food systems to become more inclusive. So we've just submitted an independent memoranda to the CAADP post-Malabo agenda. And what we did is, through the work of the Cohort 1 policy fellows that you've been doing with your peeps in the 6 countries, we've looked at the policies that you have selected to engage with and to analyze. And we've done a quick analysis of those policies in the 6 countries to identify the gender gaps. So very specific evidence on where the gaps are. In this case, we used FAO's Gender in Agriculture Policies Analysis tool to assess the extent to which gender has been integrated. We looked at 48 policies that all of you in the 6 countries, all the policy fellows are targeting in the 6 countries. And based on that analysis, we were actually able to provide evidence-based recommendations for gender responsive agri-food systems, policy design and implementation. And we've submitted this for consideration to the post-Malabo agenda. So I'm excited that now we have a new opportunity to expose you to yet one more tool that can help you to identify gaps and opportunities. And we hope you'll find it useful and you'll use it so that we can start to really influence the agenda towards gender responsiveness. Thank you so much, and over to you, Doreen.
Thank you very much, Susan. Indeed, the work that the fellows are doing is critical. And yes, as you can see, it is going to really have a life of its own beyond just what you're doing at the policy innovation level or even in your institution. So we are hoping that this would motivate you to continue working on the various policy issues in your countries and in your institutions. So without further ado, I'd like to hand this over now to our two experts, Dr. Catherine Ragasa. Dr. Catherine Ragasa, who is a senior research fellow in the Innovation, Policy and Scaling Unit at IFPRI, that is the International Food Policy Research Institute in DC. Dr. John Kyle, a research fellow in the Poverty, Gender and Inclusion Unit at IFPRI. Together, they will be presenting to us the WEAGov tool. And I'd now like to hand over to Dr. Catherine to take it over from here. And they will give us an overview of how they have structured the presentation, when we will come in with questions. So please welcome, I believe it's Jordan, yeah, come in.
Thank you so much, Doreen. Thank you so much, Susan. We are very excited to do this presentation with you. We are very excited to present the WEAGov, which is a tool that will be complementary to the GAPO tool of FAO. The WEAGov, indeed, looks at the policy design, but also extends it to implementation and evaluation. So we're very happy that we are here. I'll just introduce myself very quickly. I'm Catherine Ragasa. Indeed, in IFPRI, I've worked on several issues, several topics, subsectors in agriculture, from food safety, extension, markets, value chain, aquatic foods. And in many of my research, I integrate gender and social inclusion. I'm very lucky to have worked in many countries, and I see a lot of people from Kenya, from Nigeria, from Rwanda, Malawi, Ghana. I was so excited to go to the rural areas, talk to farmers and leaders there, and I'm hoping that those places that I haven't been, I can go and work in them or on them very soon. So I'm glad to be here. I'll hand it over to Jordan, my co-author, my co-presenter, and my partner for developing this WEAGov. Over to you, Jordan.
Hi, everyone. I want to check quickly if the presentation mode is working. Can you all see the slides? No.
No. It's not in the presentation mode, Jordan. We can see the slides, but not in the presentation mode. You can put the slideshow. Click the slideshow. Perfect.
Is that now we're good? Okay.
Yes.
Fantastic. So I'm Jordan Kyle. I said I'm a research fellow at IFPRI in the Poverty, Gender and Inclusion Unit. I'm really excited to be here with you today. I'm also a former civil servant. So I worked in the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, which is our sort of Ministry of Finance here. So I don't know if any of you are civil servants, but I have that background as well. I worked on social safety nets and food and nutrition policy here in the U.S. I've also worked in a number of countries, including in South and Southeast Asia, and a little bit in West Africa over the past few years. I saw you all start to introduce yourselves in the chat, and it's really exciting to see so many fellows from so many different countries. I am going to get us started and introduce you to WEAGov. So we're going to have a three-part sort of session today. In the first part of the session, I'm going to run through a little bit of the background on why we developed WEAGov and the gaps that it can fill and how you can use it. In part two, Catherine's going to introduce you to the WEAGov conceptual framework. So the different ideas and theories that we're drawing from to develop the WEAGov framework. And then we'll talk through an example of how to apply the conceptual framework to a policy analysis. And then we're hoping to hear from some of you on the research projects that you're doing through the award fellowship program to think a little bit about how WEAGov might be useful for you in those projects. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about the measurement tools and methodologies that we have in WEAGov publicly available that you can use. We want to introduce some of those tools to you so you can think about how to apply them. So first, why develop a new measure of women's empowerment? I probably don't need to sell this audience on the idea that women are often disproportionately affected within agri-food systems that are increasingly stressed by climate change, natural disasters, and various shocks and crises, often which affect women the most. It's critical for both fairness, justice, and policy effectiveness that all who are affected by a policy are represented within the decision-making processes that develop the policy itself. We also know that, Sustainable Development Goal number 5 calls for gender equality and women's full participation and equal opportunities for leadership in decision-making, yet women are often vastly underrepresented within decision-making spaces. So just to get an idea of this, using the Global Gender Gap Report, they track 4 domains of women's empowerment. So looking at health and longevity, educational attainment, economic empowerment, and political empowerment. You can see here sort of the top 2 lines there are health and educational attainment, where a 1 on the left-hand bar would represent gender equality. This has, I'm looking at the period from 2014 to 2024, so over the last 10 years. While there has not been much change in the health and educational attainment, those are also the closest measures to gender equality in those 2 domains. This is global, so not country specific. Economic participation and opportunity is this middle line here, where you can see that women are at about 60% of the level of men and not much progress in closing gaps in the past 10 years. But political empowerment is sort of by far the lowest area for women's attainment. So women here, we're looking at about 20%, with very little progress over the last 10 years. These numbers on the right-hand side project, based on current trends, how many years it would take to close the gender gap in each of these domains. And the Global Gender Gap Report, published by the World Economic Forum, estimates that it would take 169 years at current rates to close the gender gap in political empowerment. So women make up only 27% of members of parliament worldwide and only 23% of cabinet secretaries. I'm going to ask you all now to go on to your mobile, if you can, and take a snapshot of this QR code. It'll take you to a poll. And I was going to have you all try to guess which of these countries that are listed here, there are 6, have the highest share of women in parliament, and see if you can sort the countries from highest to lowest shares. As you start responding to the poll, the answers will start populating here in the slide, just to kind of get us warmed up for the exercise. I'm going to do it too now. There we go. And if you click send, it'll send in the responses. Awesome. Okay. So you can drag the options around to sort them based on the order that you think they are from highest to lowest shares. See a lot of votes for the United States so far. And South Africa. I'm going to give everyone about 2 minutes. A lot of United States here. Okay, I'm going to give you 1 more minute. Got more participants in here. Okay. Oh, we got 4. Okay, I'll give it another minute since we have a few people still ranking. Okay, let's go. I'm going to show you the answers, but you can keep participating in the poll. I won't close the poll. So here's what it actually looks like. So the South Africa is quite close to gender equality in terms of number of women in parliament. You can see the dotted line is at the 50%. So if we thought, you know, women and men are equal in the population, they should be roughly equal amongst elected representatives. South Africa and Mozambique are doing quite well. By this measure, the United States, maybe not so much. We've got less than 30% of our House of Representatives are female. But you know, here's the average in sub-Saharan Africa is a little less than 30%, and Nigeria sort of by far on the low side and a global outlier in terms of, I think there's only about 3% women in parliament in Nigeria. So why develop a new measure then? So the motivation, right, is around understanding gender equality in the political space. And I think maybe the bullets are off here, but there's relatively few tools actually, other than thinking about just the number of women in parliament to measure women's involvement in the political space. One way for women to be involved is to be an elected representative, but there are many more ways to engage in the policy process. And we found that there's very few, ways to measure institutionally how involved women are. And so we wanted to create something more comprehensive that would look a little bit across sectors, within ministries, really dive into the policy process and see how women are engaging. So we put together kind of a landscape review of the tools that exist that you all can use in your research of the tools that are out there to measure gender equality. And WEAGov is really trying to be at the center of 3 domains, right? We're focused on the agri-food system. So this is really about the agri-food policy process and looking at gender specifically within agri-food. and then focused on policies and governance, not necessarily household level or intra-household dynamics, the way you might see a tool like WEAGov focused. We have a literature review of these tools available on our project website for WEAGov that you can check out. So what is WEAGov? The Women's Empowerment in Agri-Food Governance is an assessment framework and tool to measure women's voice and empowerment in the agri-food and climate policy process. It was developed by IFPRI researchers with inputs from many experts and index developers from around the world, and we've piloted it in both Nigeria and in India in 2023 and 2024, respectively. You can see we have a link to our project website down at the bottom of this page. We're also happy to share it with you all after this presentation. But you can see here a quote from one of our participants in WEAGov within the Federal Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security in Nigeria, talking about how the WEAGov pilot sort of became a trigger within the ministry there for drawing more attention and focus to gender issues, and especially towards providing adequate budget and implementation support towards gender targets and policies. So this gives you a little overview of how WEAGov was developed. It really started with key informant interviews, a review of existing tools, and a theoretical review. We have since then developed those tools, piloted them, solicited more expert feedback, and now we're sort of in the stage of refining the tools based on those pilots and working with scaling partners to sort of develop more customized solutions for different contexts. So here's an overview of how WEAGov can be used and what we're going to talk through in the webinar today. So the first way that WEAGov can be used is as a conceptual framework. So WEAGov, as Catherine is going to go through, has kind of a 3x3 conceptual framework to help think about women's empowerment within a policy process. And we think these ideas and the questions that they prompt can be widely applied to different types of research projects in this sort of, gender and policy space. The second way that WEAGov can be used is as a well-developed metric where we have a suite of tools and a process that we'll talk through about implementing kind of a full WEAGov pilot. And that can really help countries identify entry points for increasing women's empowerment in national and state level agri-food policy processes to track progress over time. And then we make public the results of those pilots. So for Nigeria and soon to be India, and others can use the results of those pilots to sort of cite and decide, where to take deep dives maybe in further research efforts. The third way that WEAGov can be used is by drawing from the tools and resources that we've developed to study these issues. So we have survey instruments and measurement tools that could be used for your own research as you think about how am I going to, do a key informant interview? What questions might I ask? And, ways of doing a desk review on policies. So with this, I'm going to hand it over to Catherine, who's going to introduce you to the conceptual framework of WEAGov.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Next slide, please. So as Jordan said, WEAGov is a theory-based approach. We have done an extensive review of literature on theories and concepts, and we have consulted, we have discussed with more than 50 experts, index developers, so that we make sure that the concepts are solid. We are representing the realities on the ground, but at the same time, the tools, the measurements are practical, they're manageable, and easy to implement. For WEAGov, it really looks at several complex concepts. So we just want to make sure that let's start with some definitions of at least the concepts of agency, voice, empowerment, which are related, and they are interlinked to agri-food system and policy processes. Next slide. Agency. So agency, I think for this audience, we don't have to expand on definitions, but very quickly, agency is really the capacity, the ability to make decisions about one's own life and act upon them to achieve desired outcome free of violence, retribution, or fear. So it really encompasses not just action, but also the meaning, the motivation, and purpose for that action. So you can think of it as freedom to achieve what you want to achieve without any fear of violence or fear. So it can occur at the individual level or group level. Next slide. Voice, we have also heard a lot about it. Voice is having a say, right? Having a say in the public space. Voice is the ability to play a public role in politics and to influence decisions and policymaking. So voice can be exercised in several ways. For example, holding an office, sitting or discussing with decision makers, engaging in demonstrations, engaging in political discussions and debates, voting in elections, connecting with social movements, feminist movements, organizations, and lobbying and raising issues to political decision makers. Next slide, please. Empowerment, we have been hearing it a lot, which is great. Awareness in terms of empowerment has emerged in recent years. What do we mean by empowerment? It's the process by which those who have been denied agency are now acquiring those agency and self-determination. So think of it as those that don't have power, those that don't have capacity and agency are now having it. And that process is described as empowerment. It is really centered on control over resources, control over opportunities, and being able to influence decisions, being able to influence norms and institutions in the society. Next slide. Agri-food system, we're taking a broad definition of agri-food systems. As you know, there are many actors, many interactions, many commodities and sectors. There's a chain, there are different stages. So our definition includes crops, livestock, fish, other commodities, land, groundwater management, issues of food safety, food security, forestry. It's encompassing of those different dimensions and different subsectors. For WEAGov, we are focusing on 3 domains to make sure that we are capturing agriculture as we understand it and as we usually define it. Nutrition is a key domain, and climate or environment is also another key domain. Next slide. Policy. WEAGov is centered on policy. What is policy? Policy, we define it as government or public sector action that affects incentive and behavior of citizens. Think of it as something specific policy, like for example, input subsidy policy, extension policy, food safety policy. Those are specific policies, right? But one can also think of an accumulation, umbrella, aggregate policy at the national level. So a lot of the countries have the national agricultural policy, agricultural strategy or nutrition policy. So these are the big umbrella policies at the national level. States have also their own policies that can be independent or linked to the national policy. So those are how we define policy. Within the policy, of course, is the process, and it makes it even more important to look at the stages and the processes behind policy. This is just a very simplistic illustration, but basically you design it, right? You formulate it, then policy gets adopted, and implemented, and then the policy gets reviewed, monitored, evaluated, and then it goes back, right? The review will then feed into the reform, and then it feeds into the redesign, and the cycle continues. And each of the stages, there are several dimensions for assessment. For example, in the design, the key things to assess and the key questions that can be asked is, why is it that some priorities get featured in policy, some of the solutions are not? Who are in the policy design processes? What are the targets that are being set, and who are designing them, and why the targets are what they are? Implementation, there are also very important key questions. Are the policy targets being funded? How are they implemented? Who are implementing them? And are women, for example, included in those, implementation, processes? Same thing for evaluation, are the policies being evaluated and assessed, and how and who are evaluating them? Next slide. So we then take that policy process, right? And each of these stages, design, implementation, and evaluation, WEAGov then puts in the gender dimension. And we looked at 3 dimensions: consideration, which asked the question, are women considered? We looked at women's inclusion and asked the question, are women included? And lastly, women's leadership. Are women influencing these processes? In women's consideration on women, it includes things like setting, designing, monitoring gender targets, budgetary support, and collecting gender disaggregated data. Women's inclusion, it includes things like inputs to policy design, whether there are opportunities for women to meaningfully weigh in and provide their voice on how policies are affected, whether there are opportunities to provide feedback on policy implementation, and whether they are represented in organizations that are implementing the policies. On the last dimension on whether women are influencing, this includes, for example, looking at abilities for women to act with other women to shape policy choices, right? And whether they play leading role or influencing role in organizations that do these reviews, monitoring, evaluation of policy processes. Next slide, please. So we put that in a conceptual diagram, as you can see here. Next slide, I just want to show them that we are focusing on the central part. Very good. WEAGov centers on the middle part, which is really the intersection of the policy processes and the gender dimension. So Jordan mentioned the 3x3 matrix, or the 3x3 conceptual framework, which really focuses on understanding these 3 different gender dimensions along the policy stages of design, implementation, and evaluation. And in the middle of this process, we are calling it as the process of empowerment. And this really focuses on the formal structures at the policy level that then feeds into an outcome that we want to achieve, which is empowerment, which can be described as an agri-food governance system in which women and men and those who were denied agency and power can realize now their own choices and goals. Of course, what's happening in the policy processes, as you can see at the bottom of the diagram, is that there are the gender norms, the access to resources, even health and well-being, and even education as the enabling environment and conditioning factor or resources of empowerment that then influences what's happening at the formal processes. This diagram, our conceptual framework, emphasizes also the dynamics that's happening in all these processes. What's happening at the formal processes and the outcome of empowerment can provide positive feedback can also change what's happening in the norms and what's happening in the informal processes. So this conceptual framework we found very useful in constructing further the measurement tools, those scoring that we are doing in WEAGov. While the WEAGov first phase, the one that we are doing as the measurement tool, focuses on the center part, I think for the policy innovation project that you are doing, you can also try to incorporate, or if there are opportunities to incorporate the whole conceptual framework, for example, looking at the formal processes at the policy level, but then trying to look at some narratives, some insights onto how they influenced by gender norms, education. That could be also very interesting, I think, angle to look at in your policy innovation project. So hopefully this, conceptual framework overall would, help to frame the issues, gender issues and policy issues that you are addressing and you are assessing in your projects. Next slide, please. Let me give an example. Of course, theoretical frameworks and conceptual frameworks can be very abstract, right? So let me give an example. I know that some of you are thinking of doing your innovation policy project on seed policy in the countries that you work on. So to apply the WEAGov, concept on seed policy, these are, some of the examples of questions that you can ask, some of the questions that you can use for your assessment. For consideration for women, as the first dimension, you can look at design, implementation, and evaluation stages. For example, under design, you could ask, how did the seed policy take into account the different needs and priorities of women and men? Did the policy document have gender analysis, or did the seed policy have specific gender goals, activities, or targets? And are there specific social and economic problems and issues in the seed sector that the policy document have failed to consider? So those are the questions that you can ask. Under implementation, you can ask, are the gender targets in the seed policy funded and implemented? Right? Is there can you compare the budget that was set compared to the scope of the targets and compared to the issues and problems that were identified? Are there specific programs, projects, or schemes that are helping to implement the policy targets? And how are they being funded? How are they being implemented? And are there gender-based constraints in the implementation of the seed policy? Under evaluation, things that you can ask are there gender targets that are being monitored? How are they being monitored? Are there gender disaggregated data that are being collected and used to advocate, to adjust programs, and can be used for policy designs? Next slide. In terms of women's inclusion, things that you can ask under design are the following. You can ask, are there opportunities for women to meaningfully weigh in how that seed policy affects them? Were women's groups consulted or engaged in the design of the seed policy? Those are the questions you can ask. Under implementation, things you can ask are women represented in the implementation of the seed policy in technical positions, right? In addition to the administrative position, it's harder to have opportunities to be hired for technical and management positions. You can also ask, do women face constraints for being hired in these agencies? For example, in the Agriculture Ministry or National Seed Council or the equivalent in the countries that you work on. Evaluation, do women have opportunities to provide feedback? And are women involved in the review and evaluation of this policy? So this is just to give you a sense of what are the questions that you can ask using the WEAGov framework. Next slide. Very similarly, women's influence, similar types of questions that you can ask, whether women are influencing the design, implementation, and evaluation of these policies. Next slide. Over to you, Jordan.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Catherine. So we were hoping that you could do another Slido poll for us. If you can use this QR code on your phones to go into the poll, it'll record your responses. We wanted to hear a little bit about the type of gender analysis that you might be planning in your projects. And then we were hoping to open up a bit for discussion if anyone feels comfortable sharing the gender analysis that you're planning to do in your award projects. So if you want to get started, I'll answer as well. Give you guys a couple of minutes. And then please go ahead and think about whether you'd be willing to share a little bit about the gender analysis that you're planning to do in your award projects. I think we'll also sort of pause, and if you have any questions on the conceptual framework for Catherine and I, this is a good time in the presentation to go ahead and field some of those questions on the theory and the ideas before we jump to the measurements and tools. Oh, this is great. Really nice diversity of projects here. We got to hear a little bit about some of the projects, and we met with the group from Award. So I think Catherine and I are already really excited about the projects that you're doing and really inspired by the research topics that you're taking on. Oh, it's fantastic. Okay. So I actually don't have, when I'm in presentation mode, I don't have access to the chat, and I can't see if anyone is raising their hands. I don't know if Doreen, maybe could you help me look at the chat and see, call on people to, let's do questions first, and then maybe come in to talk about your projects.
Yes, Jordan, the chat is quiet still.
Okay.
Yes.
Got it.
Yeah. But do feel free to post in the chat. If you'd like to ask a question, you can post in the chat, and then we'll allow you to talk.
That would be
Any
great.
of the participants that have and would like to share, you can post in the chat, and then we'll allow you to talk.
Okay. If there aren't any questions, I don't know if anyone is willing to put in the chat a little bit about, that you'd be willing to talk about the gender analysis that you're planning to do in your project. We'd love to engage with you on that.
Okay, I can see Rashida Nakabuga says she can give it a try. So I will give you the chance to talk, Rashida. Let me just do that. Okay, you can go on, Rashida. Please.
Sorry, I had not
ahead.
seen the icon. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. I'm called Rashida Nakauga from Uganda. I'm working on a policy initiative project that is targeting the new EU legislation, which is the EUDR, which is the EU deforestation legislation, and the CS3D, which is a directive. So these ones are supposed to be complied within the supply chain countries. And for Uganda, I'm looking at doing a policy analysis using a gender lens. So before the country is looking at integrating or aligning our country policies with the international policies, assessing whether the women and youth have been engaged, and they are also in discussions and consultations to align with the compliance. I said I'll give it a try because I'm still struggling between 1 and 2. Thank you.
Would you feel comfortable mentioning at all the things that you're struggling with on the project that you referenced?
Well, I'm just looking at the questions that you have given to us, gender analysis to inform policy, and then a policy analysis using a gender lens. I feel like I'm in both, you know, because I'm informing the policy process for the country, looking at the international policies, international regulations and directives that we are supposed to comply with. And to give it a small face is that all supply countries that produce coffee and cocoa, for example, if you're to export to the EU, then you have to comply to the EU deforestation policy, which is supposed to be, you know, aligned with the country policies. Yeah.
That's very good. Thank you for sharing. I think indeed it's a case of both and more of like the policy analysis. I think in your case, it's a specific regulation and a specific case of, you know, compliance and how women are able to comply with those, you know, regulations. Are they able to participate, and what are the gender-based, you know, constraints in them? And in doing so, it really provides, you know, then a lot of, you know, insights, a lot of information on how then they can perhaps reform that that regulation, or it could, you know, provide, you know, information as to whether the regulation is good and or not. It's basically the inclusion, the equity that would matter, you know, most. So I think the aim of this one is just to try to understand, you know, what are the range of innovation policy projects that are out there, whether the focus is on existing policy documents, existing policies, and looking at content analysis, you know, what's written, what's in there in the policy existing, right? Looking at it from a gender perspective, or doing broader gender analysis, not necessarily policy based. It's not a focus on a policy, but gender analysis in general. But in doing so, right, the gender analysis can feed into some, you know, policy actions at the end. So they are very much, you know, related. It's not, maybe in many cases, it's not or, but can be both. But we just, you know, want to understand whether it's something that's policy content, you know, analysis that you're doing, or something else. Then we could, you know, then cater the emphasis of what kind of, you know, emphasis we can make within the different, you know, aspects of WEAGov, or within the different, you know, tools available, you know, out there. There's a question to explain more about the conceptual framework. We can, you know, do that. As I've said, it's conceptual frameworks are very abstract by definition because, you know, they are a framework. Let's try to listen in, wait for the discussion on more details on the conceptual framework when we are presenting the measurement tools. Maybe it can help understand the conceptual framework better, right? If we have more chance later on, if we have some time, you know, later on, we can go to that one, or we can, you know, have, you know, bilateral discussions or other things that we can do later on. So let's wait for the measurement, you know, so that we can have, you know, more ideas into the specifics of the conceptual, you know, framework.
That's a great response. Thank you so much. And I guess you guys can already see that I put up a new slide If you're comfortable sharing a few words, some of you have already jumped in, which is great, about your project. We're super eager to learn. I don't know is anyone else willing to come off mute and share a little bit about the gender analysis that you're planning? No other volunteers?
I can try.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, so my name's Mwaka, and I am from Zambia, Kitwe. So for my policy innovation project, I'm looking at women in leadership and the need for them to have mentors in place. So for our national gender policy, what I have noticed with the discussions that I've had with experts is that it does not have an implementation plan. And bringing it back to the group that I'm working with, I'm able to see that women, in as much as there's an affirmative action to have women in these leadership positions, women are still shying away. Women are not willing to stand up or even voice out. So looking at your tool, I think it will be very helpful in my situation, because I've noticed that women, especially if you're going to bring in cultural norms, we have a lot of work to do in that area. So I've noticed that in as much as there are projects meant for women, you find that at the end of the day, it's the men who tend to benefit from them. It's slowly being taken away from them whilst they are watching. And yeah, I think there's quite a lot of work that needs to be done, not just at the policy design, but also at the implementation phase. Thank you.
Yeah, I think
Very good.
That's such an important point and perspective. And it was one of our key motivations for developing WEAGov, I think, was that we really wanted that institutional, background, and like, not just, so the policy content is important, like what are the words on the page, but how are those words being translated into outcomes? How are they being implemented? Are they being funded? Are gender targets being monitored? Like, what's the process through which countries and ministries are or are not sort of translating that design into outcomes and what people, experience on the ground? And so I think what you're talking about is super common. When we did the WEAGov pilot in Nigeria, we held a policy dialogue at the end where, people from the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Budget were kind of looking at the results. And I think one takeaway there was sort of, well, we really need to focus on the implementation side and how to fund the targets that we already have, not necessarily like improving the design, which, as you'll see when we kind of show you some of the results from Nigeria, was not too bad. Like, there are sort of some gender targets in the major national policies. So I think that's quite common, that things sort of fall apart at the implementation stage, and it can be really helpful to focus key informant interviews and try to surface, what are the real issues here. I don't know if you were going to come in.
Very good. Yeah, no, great response, Jordan. But just building on the project on leadership, I think it's really great. And I think the WEAGov can be useful in several ways. I think, looking at leadership in several levels, right? Community, but then you have also the institution, level, you have also national, level. Where is, leadership in different levels of decision making? So that's, important, and that conceptual framework within WEAGov can help bring out those different levels that one has to look at. Another one where WEAGov framework can be useful is, again, you have also mentioned that the leadership or gaps in leadership in different levels of decision making can be influenced by gender norms, right? So the norms can be different in different levels: community versus local government versus state government and national level. They operate in different types of power dynamics, different institutions, different gender norms. So I think that that linkages that we are trying to bring in the conceptual framework can be very useful, I think, in looking at those, dimensions.
Okay. So, Jordan, I think Adama wants to speak. If you could allow her to talk, she wants to make an intervention. Adama Gwaye.
Please go ahead.
So I'll ask one of my colleagues if they can allow her to talk. Go ahead. Yes, now you have permission to talk. And then we'll come to you, Joel.
Bonjour. Bonjour.
Bonjour, we can hear you.
Ok.
Continuez, s'il vous
Merci.
plaît.
Merci beaucoup. En fait, je voulais parler un peu de mon projet aussi. Je suis sénégalaise, je suis au Sénégal, je suis partie du programme GRAPS, je suis fellow et j'aimerais travailler un peu sur l'entrepreneuriat féminin, son impact sur l'activité agricole. Ma problématique porte sur le fait que depuis 1960 jusqu'à aujourd'hui, il y a plusieurs politiques agricoles qui ont été menées ici au Sénégal. Et toutes ces politiques n'ont pas pu avoir les résultats escomptés. On a toujours des problèmes de productivité. On a du mal à nourrir la population avec notre simple production. On importe des quantités très importantes de produits alimentaires et nous avons une économie qui est plutôt extravertie. Toutefois, dans certaines filières, nous avons remarqué que ces filières ont pu se développer et que les femmes sont très actives dans ces différentes filières. Et, je prends l'exemple de la filière du mil, où on a vu que le mil est passé à une culture vivrière vers une culture de rente. Et grâce à la transformation où les femmes sont très actives dans ce secteur. Et dans mon projet, j'aimerais pouvoir voir comment est-ce que l'entrepreneuriat féminin dans cette filière a pu améliorer les performances de cette filière et comment est-ce que ces performances-là pourraient être reproduites sur les autres filières agricoles afin de pouvoir avoir un développement général de l'activité agricole et arriver à une souveraineté alimentaire. Donc, voilà un peu en résumé le projet sur lequel j'aimerais pouvoir travailler. Merci.
I don't know if anyone can help translate for us. I sadly don't speak French.
Jordan, sorry, I didn't hear.
I was just saying, could one of the interpreters summarize for us, as I don't speak French?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, Adama was talking about her project, her the focus of her policy intervention in Senegal, and she's interested in working with women entrepreneurs. And she mentioned how there are many policies in Senegal that are, but they seem not to address the key issue around entrepreneurship and agriculture. So they still rely a lot on importation. So she's very interested to analyze the policies to identify where the gap is and how she could support women and agripreneurs in Senegal. I hope I got that right in a nutshell. Yeah, so. And
Perfect.
then for
my
just to
English is
mention,
not good, but I can try to explain, summarize what I'm talking about. If it is okay for you.
sorry, there's also opportunity to just click on the interpretation button to just listen in English, because there's real-time interpretation. But go ahead, Adama.
Okay, thank you. Oh, so what I'm talking about is I want to work on entrepreneurships with women, because in our country we apply policy on agriculture since in 1960, and it doesn't success. And so I see there are some goods where women are very active, for example, the millet. And in this sector, the production grows, and there are many productivity because of the entrepreneurial of women. And that's why I want to analyze the activity of women in this sector, to reply it on the other sector, and see how they can boost this sector in agriculture in general. Thank you.
Thank you
Wow.
so much.
Yeah, I think that's very, very relevant. And I think, WEAGov can help in assessing and understanding what's, happening, like why you think policies are there, but they're not working, right? So that's already a starting point. So is it the policy? Is it the design of the policy that's, the problem? Is it the implementation of the policy, or maybe we are not, evaluating, the policy? So looking at those different stages of the policy and see the bottlenecks, see the gaps and opportunities, there. So I think, it's very relevant, and WEAGov can support through tools to the survey and the conceptual, framework in trying to understand and assess, what's happening in that sector.
Yeah, and that's great. And I think another thought I had is I think many of the projects may sort of be like this, where you're maybe doing some kind of gender analysis to advocate for a policy reform, or to, advocate for a change in policy. And I think one way that WEAGov could be really helpful, and that you could really, increase the impact of your analysis, is through, a stakeholder analysis. Like it sounds like, there are all these women entrepreneurs who maybe aren't being taken into account in the policy space. And just by, identifying, here's a set of actors or associations or groups that should be consulted during, a potential policy reform, that could be really helpful and influential, as well as identifying, like, what is the data that may be gender disaggregated data that's not being collected now by ministries because they're missing this whole sort of group or dynamic, this set of outcomes. What's the data that they could and should be collecting, to see the impact of existing policy, or to evaluate, the impact of a change, and being able to make those kinds of recommendations in addition to the design recommendation, I think could be really, really useful. I think given the time, I think I'm going to advocate that we move on. But I still want, we'll take another pause in a bit if you have more questions about WEAGov. And, Catherine and I shared our email addresses at the beginning of the presentation. We're happy to engage with you all. We're really enthusiastic about this great work that you guys are doing. Hold on. Okay, so we're going to move on to the sort of third part of the presentation, where we take a deep dive into some of the measurement tools and methodologies available in WEAGov, and talk about sort of how we do desk review, interview organizations involved in the agri-food sector, and then interview key experts in a country's policy process. Okay, so this is our WEAGov kind of infographic, where you can see all of the different indicators that we use. And so now you can see in this circle goes through those different stages of the policy process that we introduced. So beginning with policy design, policy implementation, and then policy evaluation. And in each of those stages, you can see that we ask these key questions about how women are engaged. So are they considered, are they included, and are they influencing? And within each of those, within each of those buckets, we have an indicator, and then we have 44 different measurements to sort of measure those indicators that you can see in this infographic. I think there's maybe somebody needs to mute. Is there a thanks. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So we put the web address of our infographic here at the bottom. This infographic is interactive. So when you click into different parts of the diagram, you can find all kinds of information about definition, about how we measure and score. And so I think this would be a really useful resource for anyone who wants to take a deep dive or focus on a specific part of the policy process for your research question. For each measure, we assign one of 4 scores, ranging from kind of very weak or low, amount of women's, consideration, inclusion, or influence, up to strong. And we kind of consider level 4, that's what we would consider to be at goal, or, reflective that women are exercising true voice and agency within that part of the policy process. Some scores that we have in WEAGov, so some of the measurements are going to be based on desk review. So things that you can, do through publicly available documents that you can analyze. So I think these measures will be really useful to you all as you do your policy projects. Some scores are based on, surveying the organizations that are involved in the agri-food policy process. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then other scores are based on the perceptions and expertise of key local experts within the agri-food policy process. Just so you can get a sense of what the infographic looks like. And again, here's the QR code for our website link. When you click on any of the indicators, you'll see, how it's measured and defined. And then you can click over to the scoring tab and you can see how is each kind of score defined, like what is that goal, what is advancing, getting close to the goal, what's on the way, so not quite there, but better than nothing, and what, kind of a low score we're counting as. So I encourage you to use this website to take a deep dive onto any of the indicators. So I want to show you a little bit, if when we do a full sort of WEAGov pilot, we can kind of do 2 different things with it. So one is we can look at key agri-food policies and identify where they might be falling short. So, we look at the agricultural development plan at the national level, sort of whatever that is for the country. We look at the key food or nutrition policy, and then we look at a key climate policy that's relevant for agriculture. And these policies are selected, in consultation with local experts in country in terms of, these are really the key policies for the sector. And you can look at the WEAGov scores and kind of see, oh, maybe things are going well in the design stage. There was a lot of consultation. They set gender targets. Maybe even you have some women leading on policy writing teams. But when you get to the implementation stage, maybe this is where you see things sort of lose track a little bit. Maybe they aren't monitoring or tracking the key targets. They're not adequately funding them. There aren't women in technical positions that are taking some responsibility and ownership for implementing policy. Or, in the evaluation stage, maybe they're not collecting data on the key indicators and outcomes that they would need to track in order to know whether the policy is being successful, or maybe they aren't open to citizen feedback on how policies are working on the ground. And so that's one way that you can kind of use WEAGov scoring, is to show, okay, where's really the key point where we need to make some improvement in this policy. The other way that you can kind of think about WEAGov scores is by thinking about, the policy process and the organizational setup as a whole. So are there specific institutional gaps where there should be, women's inclusion or involvement, but we're just not seeing it? And that might be true across all policies. So for example, are there just not, are women not leading in agri-food ministries? Are there hiring issues and bottlenecks that are preventing women from rising in technical positions, so they're not playing any managerial roles in the implementation process, regardless of which policy they're responsible for implementing? Other key things that we look at, might be in the design process, do countries consult widely, at the citizen level and the group level, not just amongst elites? Or do they have these formal mechanisms for collecting citizen feedback on how policies are going? And so you can kind of look at either how policies are going, or you can look at the institutions to understand where might be a gap where if we, change things, you would see more women's involvement. So here, this is just an example from our Nigeria pilot, where these are the WEAGov scores from our scoring system for the national agricultural policy, national climate policy, and nutrition policy. And then they also have a gender and agriculture policy. Perhaps not surprisingly, the design stage looks quite strong for the national gender policy and agriculture. It looks a little weaker, for the national agriculture policy. And then the scores kind of get worse as you get into implementation and evaluation. This was from our India pilot, which we're just finishing up now and look forward to publishing a report on soon. You can see here for their national sort of agriculture, nutrition, and climate policies, that they actually have a quite strong design stage in terms of setting, gender targets and having strong gender analysis within the policy documents. But they have a similar feature as Nigeria in that the indicators kind of get weaker as we get closer to implementation and evaluation. There's also some differentiation across the policy space, and that we saw, stronger implementation and evaluation for Mission Poshan, which is one of their key sort of food and nutrition policies, compared to the agriculture policy. And again, these are sort of relative to gender, not just in general. So we're always asking, about the implementation of gender targets specifically. So this is from our country brief on Nigeria, which summarizes the results of that pilot. You can find that on our project website at the URL that we shared. And this is kind of looking across those 11 indicators and 44 measurements. What are the specific scores? And one thing I want to emphasize is that, WEAGov is really a tool for identifying gaps and opportunities. And so, this score kind of becomes the beginning of a policy dialogue where local experts can work on, okay, here's a gap, here's an opportunity for improvement. What do we want to prioritize going forward to try to take, concrete steps to increase women's engagement and voice and agency in this part of the policy process? It's not, sort of about ranking countries in terms of who's stronger on this or that dimension. This is really about finding gaps and opportunities for increasing women's voice and agency. So this shows you, like, when we do the policy dialogue at the end of a WEAGov pilot, we try to talk about, well, what are the strengths within the policy process that we identified that you can build off of. So, in Nigeria, one of the strengths was the national gender policy in agriculture. Another strength that we identified in the pilot is sort of women's leadership and engagement in the advocacy and civil society sectors, where, even if you might not have that same level of representation within the government ministries, by being open to consultations and engagement with civil society sector, that's a key avenue for bringing in more women's voices. And then we talk about, the weaknesses that are identified through the pilot. So one of them was just, really few opportunities for citizens in general to engage in either, design or providing feedback on how policies are going. And so setting up, formal processes for consultation at the front end and continuous, feedback once policies are in place. That was something that's not just a problem for women, but it was a problem for all citizens. And then, of course, budgetary outlays was a significant issue, not having budgetary lines for the gender targets that were being set. And so sort of local actors identified wanting, stronger coordination across ministries to ensure that they're getting a budgetary line at the time that the target was being set. This was just a photo from the workshop that we held in December. You can see Catherine there standing next to the Minister of Budget and Economic Planning. We had a great policy dialogue around the WEAGov tool, and really a lot of momentum and interest around strengthening cross-ministry cooperation there towards funding gender targets. So it was really exciting. They even made a video about WEAGov, which was really nice, and you can find that on our website too. So Catherine, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jordan. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. What Jordan presented is basically the result, right? Or how you can use WEAGov, the scoring, how we can analyze the scores, those that got 3 or 4, which are the yellow and green. Those indicate strength in the different stages and different dimensions of a national agri-food policy process. Those that got 1 or 2 scores, the red and the orange, they signify, they indicate the weaknesses in the different stages. So WEAGov can be used to identify which gaps are strongest or more serious than the others. Then it helps in prioritization. It helps on focusing, what are the weakest, areas, and also the strengths that can be built on. But you might be wondering, how did the data come and what's the data collection processes? So I'll describe them very quickly. I know we have not too much time, but it's just an overview. It's just a snapshot right now. If there are questions, if you want more details, we will be happy to provide. WEAGov really centers on 5 stages. First, just like what Jordan said, you need to look at the institutional landscape, right? Who are the stakeholders, and what are the different, policies there. So it depends, what you are analyzing. For us, for the WEAGov full implementation, full metric and adaptation, we look at the national agri-food system, which then is, broader. So for our pilot in Nigeria and India, we looked at 16 agri-food policies, and within that, we had to focus on fewer that we can track in the surveys. So from the 19 policies, we focus on the 4 most important policies. In India pilot, we focus on 30 policies, 10 each theme, 10 on agriculture, 10 on climate, and 10 on nutrition. And then we had to streamline to 6 major policies, 2 per theme, 2 for agriculture, nutrition, and 2 for climate to track in our surveys. So that's the first step in WEAGov. The second one is desk review. A lot of the indicators and measurements of WEAGov relies on objective and quantifiable indicators that, documentation is available, secondary data or administrative data are available. So that's, the second step in WEAGov. Next is organizational survey. We sampled 141 organizations in Nigeria, 133 organizations in India. The fourth is expert survey. So from those organizations, we identified key experts in those organizations. We interviewed 241 in Nigeria, 166 in India. The last one, which Jordan just mentioned, is the technical validation, workshop, wherein we have the results from the surveys, right? But then it was super important to bring together like fewer, more selected, more targeted set of experts so that they can validate those results and think also of what are the gaps in the results and some, policy implications and usefulness and relevance of the results that we are seeing. Next slide. So I'll give very quick, specifics on those steps. One is the policy content analysis, right, or the desk review. As I mentioned, for WEAGov full implementation, we're looking at the national agri-food system. So the mapping of agri-food policies that we did is more comprehensive. We've looked at agricultural policy, from food security, agricultural transformation, innovation policies. We've looked at them, nutrition policy, climate policy. But then there are also other development plans that are critical or influential documents that dictates, budget, allocation. So we also looked at that. Another key document is the speech by the head of state, the prime minister or president, for example, because it signifies the priority, the direction of the country and its leaders on what are the important issues, what are the important problems that they are prioritizing, and their priority actions and strategies to address them. In your particular case, since you are focusing on a specific sector, you might not have to do all of these things, right? But I think what will be useful in your innovation policy project is to think through several policies that are most relevant to you. The agricultural policy is, of course, key. If you are talking about seed policy, for example, right, there might be a separate seed policy than the agricultural policy. You might need to look at the nutrition, policy, also, because if you're looking at, seed, there's question on food, safety and biofortification, nutrition sensitive agriculture, and so forth. And then climate, in many of your projects, you're looking at the environment, on deforestation, and so forth. And climate policy in the country would address concerns on those issues and see whether gender is incorporated in them. As I've said, for our WEAGov full implementation, we've looked at 19 policies in Nigeria, 30 policies in India, and we streamlined it to a shorter list so that we can focus on fewer set of policies that we track in the surveys. Next slide, please. This is just to give a sense of what do we do with these policy documents, right? So to analyze the documents, to analyze the content of the document, we focus on the general objectives and goals, right? And we see how gender is featured in the policy document. We use keywords such as gender, women, girls, name them. We've looked at whether there's gender analysis or gender study that guided or informed that policy. We've looked at gender disaggregated data, whether it's mentioned in the policy document. And we look at specific gender targets, gender objectives that really looks at equality and women's empowerment. And we've used the REACH benefit empowerment transform framework, which many of you might be familiar with. So we're not just looking at labor participation, for example, definitely not women or female-headed or male-headed households, which is more narrow, but we're looking really at agency, we're looking at empowerment, we're looking at decision-making. So we've looked at access and control over, use of inputs, resources, opportunities, women's entrepreneurship. Many of you are working on value chains and women's entrepreneurship. So it's really key to identify, are these policies really talking about these issues? Not just, women as the vulnerable group, but women as entrepreneurs and providing economic empowerment for women. So does the policy even talk about that? So that's what we were looking at. Women's welfare and nutrition, right? We looked at how the policy addresses this. Women's voice, participation in institutions, women's leadership, women, and how they're affected by norms and structural gender inequalities. Are there discriminatory policies or regulations or laws out there in the country specific to the sector? Are they being discussed in the policy document? So we looked at that. There's a comment in the chat that asked about intersectionality. Yes, we address intersectionality in several areas, in several indicators and measurements, not fully but it's addressed in some of the indicators, and one of them is in this policy content analysis. So in addition to searching words like women, gender, we also search for words and also analyze how they are addressing or featuring youth or different age groups, poor or marginalized groups, or different socioeconomic status, caste, smallholders versus medium and large, ethnic groups, tribes, etc. So we have that as our checklist to look at in our policy gender analysis. Very importantly, and this is what I will also want to emphasize. So in addition to just looking at the policy document, right, the paper, what's in paper, it will be also very useful, very important to see, are women included in the consultation processes? Are there documentations, evidence, for example, in the annex or report or drafts or media coverage about the policy on the consultation processes that were done, and whether women and what type of women are included in those processes? If there are documentation or evidence that could lead you to say something about women's participation in those processes. One thing that can be useful is looking at the drafting team or the advisory, supervisory, review team of the policies. Are women even part of those writing teams or advisory teams? So those are useful from the voice and agency perspective. Next slide, please. So these are scoring in relation to WEAGov, the full implementation of the WEAGov. 1, no mention of gender at all. 2, limited gender analysis. 3, there's some gender analyses. There are also, like 1 or 2 goals related to gender, but there's really no specific measurable target, no details on how to track them. Number 4 is like the ideal, right? There's strong gender analysis. There are specific, goals. So if you're focusing on a specific sector, there are the issues there are addressed very well. The goals and targets really speak to those, issues and the problems that were identified. There are indicators, performance indicators in their monitoring and the results, framework, and there's an implementation plan. So we would, say this is an exemplary in their attention to gender and women's empowerment. In your particular case, you don't have to do the scoring, but maybe insights, just insights, narratives on, how they were addressed in the policy, right? And that intersectionality, that's more than enough. That's already good. But the idea is to look at not just how many times they mention gender, but the quality and the content of how they address gender, and whether those goals and targets that were set, the ambitions that were set, really correspond to the priority problems that were identified. Next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot of Nigeria, 19 policies that we have reviewed. As you can see here, it's great. They have the national gender policy in agriculture. The problem really, what Jordan presented, is that they have a good policy, right? But it seems that they're falling short in terms of implementation, budgetary support, and evaluation. They have also good scores in their nutrition policy and climate policy, 3, so that's fairly okay. But in terms of their national agricultural policy, the score is 2. Women is not addressed sufficiently in their major agriculture policy. And you can see here the other subsector policies in agriculture. There's hardly any mention of, gender or women. It just, shows how limited the gender consideration in the agri-food policy in Nigeria. Next slide, please, which I will be showing to you also the case in India. In India, this is agricultural policies, 10 that we have analyzed there. It's better than Nigeria, but still out of 10, 5 scored 1 and 2. And similarly for nutrition, next slide, and climate change, also next slide, they are better, right? But we still see some of them got 1 or 2. 30% of the 10 climate change policies and nutrition policies got very low scores. Just to give you a snapshot of how we did the scoring and the policies that we have selected for India and Nigeria. Next slide, please. For here, we just want to show you more indicators that rely on desk review. As Jordan mentioned in our infographics, our measurement tool, right, where we use 44 measurements. So out of the 44 measurements, 13 of those rely on desk review or content analysis. So 5 of them are the content analysis, which I just described to you: agriculture policy, climate change policy, and nutrition policy, right? And development plan, the gender policy in agriculture. So those were the 5 measurements related to policy content analysis. So the other 8, it's not 7, but 8 other measurements are based on objective, indicators. And I have listed them in the first column. First one is to get a sense of whether the country has a formal process of collecting citizens' input in policy design, processes. That's one. And whether there are formal processes, formal and systematic mechanisms for citizens, women and different types of, women to provide feedback on policy implementation. And how we scored it is a Likert scale 1 to 4, consistent with the policy content, analysis. 1 being no formal process, no systematic mechanism, and consultations are rarely done. Number 2, a little bit better. There are still no formal and systematic processes, but some consultations are done. Number 3, much better, but some improvements can be done. There's still no formal and systematic mechanisms, but a lot of consultations, are done. And 4 is the ideal, wherein there are formal and systematic processes and consultations are adequate. The third one, which is still desk review, right, but can be complemented with key informants interview, especially if there's not too many available documentation in public domain, public space, is the share of women national parliamentarians. So it should be available online. The second one is the share of women in agricultural committees in the parliaments. That's another measure that we are tracking. And the third one is the share of female ministers in the core agri-food ministries. In here, of course, the goal is 50%, right? Or at least 50% women in this high level decision-making levels. And then 0 to 15% would be very low, 16 to 32% women in this high level positions would be low. And then 33% to 49%, which is really the basis of quota in a few of the countries, it's 3. It's good, but then, they can achieve, more in terms of or towards, equality. We've also looked at gender disaggregated, statistics, right? And again, it's similar type of, scoring. There's not much attention. There's not much gender disaggregated data. That's number 1. Number 2, there's some disaggregated data, but then it's only on labor allocation or participation in the different sectors of agri-food system. Number 3, there's more the gender disaggregated data collected. There's on economic outcomes. There's food security. There's dietary diversity of women, men, girls, and boys, but still no indicators related to intra-household dynamics, control over agency, empowerment. No indicators collected at the national level. Number 4. It collects many indicators that are gender disaggregated, individual level, data, looking also at, agency and empowerment. Next slide, please. So the desk, review, they're available, right? So I think it would be very useful to include in your innovation policy.
You supposed to video. Did you video? No video.
Oh, if you can mute yourselves, please.
Of doing that, this thing, oh.
Can we continue?
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Great. So for WEAGov, we do the scoring, right? It's great if you can do it. As I've said, 13 out of 44 of our measurements are desk review. So they should be easy to do. The documents are available publicly. So we really highly suggest that you include them in your innovation policy project. If the scoring is not possible, for example, it's still possible to do it in key informants, interview aspect, or fewer set of policies. But the important thing we can highlight are 3. In your policy content, analysis, focus on how they address the problem, right? Whether those, why those targets are set, whether and how they address, the problems, and whether the targets are sufficient and whether they have monitoring and evaluation indicators to track progress over time. The second is expand your policy content analysis, and not just on the policy document itself, but try to look for available documentation, evidence on their budget allocation. So it should move beyond the policy itself, but are those policies implemented? And are there statistical system and are there gender disaggregated data that are being collected to support the evaluation of those policies? Next slide, please. And the next slide, I think several of you are doing the content analysis. So this is the policy, and you're looking at the specific wordings and integration, consideration of gender in those policy documents. So you know already the GAPO tool, which I highly recommend to use for content analysis of policies. I also suggest one more study, one more paper by Droxa and colleagues in 2020. The link is here. And then on the right side are the dimensions that they look at and the research questions that they're looking at. So they looked at gendering the policy, structural understanding, intersectionality is here, incremental transformation, and how they relate to regional and international contextualization. So if the focus of your innovation policy project is on content analysis of these policies, I think this is also a useful tool to incorporate. Again, I highly suggest that if you are looking at policy content analysis, expand it a bit more. Look for how these policies are implemented. Look at how these policies are evaluation. As Jordan has emphasized in her slide, that the policy might be good by design, but why we are seeing no impact or limited impact, it's maybe because of the implementation and evaluation. You don't have to follow the full scoring or the full toolkit of WEAGov, but at least get some evidence on how the policies are implemented and evaluated, and the WEAGov tool can support you to think through what are the questions to be asked, what data to collect. Next slide, please. And those of you who are doing more of the, not on the policy content analysis, but gender analysis more broadly, and then you are informing what could be a policy direction, right? I strongly suggest looking at IFPRI's Research, Benefit, Empower, RBE framework. I really like this as a framework because it really separates, it really distinguishes what are the factors or what are the dimensions that are only reaching women, right? And the example that I have given here is an extension project, an agriculture extension year project, wherein if you're just looking at rich, right, rich, then we're just looking at how many women are being trained, how many women got the extension services, right? But that's not enough. We have to really look at whether women are benefiting from that extension service. So we need sex disaggregated data on yield, income, time use, etc., so that we're not just counting how many got training or how many you got that information, but there's really benefit to them. We can also expand it further to look at empowerment, looking at agency, decision making, control over resources, reduction of gender-based violence, and time burden. So I really like this framework, and I really encourage you to consider this in your gender analysis, so that we are just not talking about how we are reaching women, but how we are benefiting and empowering women. In the next slide, if we can go to the next slide, other authors have also expanded the RBE framework and added T, RBET. And the T is transform, which really looks at the enabling environment. So it's not enough to reach, benefit, empower women, but we have to transform the environment. So this looks at the gender norms, and formal and informal processes that hinders or provide opportunities to address women's and men's issues. So I really highly suggest to put also the T in your assessment and in your thoughts and in your thinking. And when you are considering transformative approaches, right? To look at not just gender norms, but look at the formal processes and the role of policy. Again, here comes, the usefulness of WEAGov. So we really encourage you to look at the policies, how they are implemented, and evaluation. You might not have the resources to do the full WEAGov tool, but then aspects of it, parts of it that will be useful for you. And the WEAGov tool can help you will guide you in what data and what indicators to use. Next slide, please. So I'll go to the next data collection process. We just heard about the policy content analysis or the desk review, right? As I've said, WEAGov also looks at the implementation and evaluation. So we use organizational survey. Out of the 44 measurements that Jordan mentioned, 8 rely on organizational survey. In the full WEAGov measurement, we are looking at the whole country, right? And all agri-food, policy processes. So we have a more complicated, system of, sampling, and it's a bigger study. In your case, it will be smaller, especially if you're looking at a particular policy or a particular subsector. So it might not be as intense. It might not be that time consuming or resource needing as what we did for a national agri-food policy system, for example. But what I'll describe is what we did at the national level. And then it can perhaps inspire you or motivate you to think of, okay, that's from a bigger scale. Maybe I can downscale it to fit my purpose, but then it's looking at the same methods, the same indicators, same types of questions that you're going to ask. So that's the idea. So for at the national level, the goal really of WEAGov to track what's happening at the national level is to look at how policies are formulated, right? And it's usually at the federal level, if it's at a national agricultural policy, as our case. And then the implementation and evaluation as we know it is at the state or local level. So in terms of our sampling, organizations that are involved in the policy process or are very active in the agri-food arena, we use them as a sample. So we contacted as much as possible, as many of them. Of course, not all were willing and have time to talk to us, but we got a very good diversity of different actors from government, private sector, NGOs, multilateral organizations working in the countries, academe, research community. We have also covered it, which is shown in the two tables here in terms of representation of different organization types, wide diversity. In terms of state and federal level, it's also a good diversity and representation. While at the federal government level, we tried to contact as many of the organizations as possible, right? At the state level, it was more complicated because we couldn't go to all the states. How many states in Nigeria? It's a lot, for example. But what we did is to look at geopolitical zones and select, one that could be a good representation of that geopolitical zone. So we went to 5 geopolitical zones in Nigeria. We couldn't go to one for security reasons. So it gives then the organizational survey and the data that we have on expert survey gives then a good diversity of the different states and the different geographical zones, and gives confidence on the breadth and diversity and representation of experts and their perceptions. Next slide, please. So Jordan said 44 measurements, right, for WEAGov. 8 of them are based on organizational survey. Out of the 8, 4 measurements are along the lines of share of women in management positions or staffing in this sample organizations. So for example, our measurements are share of women leaders in non-governmental sector, share of non-managerial female staff, so that we know that there are opportunities of hiring or they are being hired in technical positions in this policy implementing agencies, female managerial positions in policy implementing agencies, and also managerial positions in those agencies that are involved in policy review, policy research, policy evaluation. So in all of this, we have a consistent scoring, 1 to 4 point, 4 being at least 50% of women achieve the 50% of the organizations are led by women, for example. 0 to 15% is in 1 or very low. 2 is 16 to 32% of women. 3, 33%, about 1/3 of women or organizations are being led, by women. Next slide, please. The other 4 indicators of the 5 measurements relates to the share of organizations with gender intentional strategies. And the idea is to have as many organizations, if not all organizations, to be doing good gender work, right? Or have some, gender intentional staffing strategies or gender intentional activities. So one measurement that we have, for example, is, whether those organizations that are core ministries doing food policy have the gender responsive budgeting process, whether they have a gender policy at the organization or they're doing leadership training, they have gender diversity, committee. So those are indications that are serious in doing gender. We also ask whether they have quota in leadership, and we are also, asking whether they conduct, gender audit in their organization and in the policies that are involved in and projects that are involved in periodically or regularly. So again, I've said the goal is to have as many organizations as possible that have this, gender intentional strategies. The aim, the ideal is 75% to 100% of our sample organizations to have this gender intentional strategies. And then moving, backwards, score 1 would be only 0 to 24% of the organizations. Score 2, 25% to 49% of the organizations, and 3, 50 to 74% of the organizations. Again, the scoring is the foundation of, WEAGov. You don't have to do it in your innovation policy project, but get a sense of, where they are in terms of staffing and where they are in terms of women leading those organizations and whether there's some indications of their gender intentionality. Next slide, please. This is just, like a quick sample of the organizational question that we have. We can move on to the other slide. The last one that I'm going to discuss, with you, and we can, conclude it in like 15 minutes or so. We can open up, we can leave, 10 minutes, for questions, but I'll talk about the third major data collection method that we use, expert survey, right? And 23 of the 44 measurements, 23 out of 44 measurements are based on the expert survey. We implemented it. It took 30 to 60 minutes in India and Nigeria when we implemented the survey. We programmed the survey questionnaire into copy so they can be filling it online. It doesn't have to be in-person interviews, but it's recommended. But a lot of our interviews, a lot of our surveys were phone interviews, and they were even filling it online because it's an online version. So here it was easier in terms of sampling because we have already identified organizations, right, that are working on agri-food system. We have already contacted the organizations. They have already responded to our survey at that organizational level. So we asked the head of the organization to respond to the expert survey and recommend others in the staff, key staff, like the head, the leaders, the officials, the ones that are involved in the policy, gender contacts in the organization. So those are our target experts. So this is not really going to the household level, right? The rural areas, the communities and so forth. This is first and foremost like looking at, perceptions of, experts because, they are key linkages to what's happening in the rural spaces and at the national policy making processes. And the idea is that WEAGov can complement then other studies, other tools, other data that focuses at the household and community level. So we want to emphasize that it focuses on the meso institutional organizational aspects, and not going to the impact of policy at the household or community level. So we're looking at the process. We're looking at the policy process itself. So as you can see in the tables, there's wide diversity of the different positions of the different experts that we interviewed. They're coming from different organizations. We interviewed 30% female and 62% male, different diverse age groups. Since this is an expert survey, most of them, almost all of them have bachelor's degree, and 50% have master's or PhD degree. So this is the perspective of the experts. Next slide, please. So perception question. So the expert survey was implemented, and it's a core part of WEAGov because we want to get at the perception, the insights, right? And as we know, perception is very crucial. There's a value to it in measuring complex concepts of governance and policy process. Why perception is important? It just gives diverse perspectives, insights, and voices of stakeholders. It is also a very good option methodologically and research-wise for concepts that are really hard to measure and really complex. And the third one, using perception question, if combined with available objective measures, can really provide a strong triangulation of data and results. But we have to be also mindful that there are limitations to using perception measurements, right? Individuals have imperfect knowledge, right? So the more sample we have, the better. And that's what we tried to do in WEAGov. There's also systematic differences based on context, location, different implementation stages and status. So of course, they would have, different perspective, right? So getting diverse sample, whether you have a large, sample size or smaller sample size, like a qualitative, type of approach, diversifying your sample will help address this consideration. And then disaggregating the data so that you can explain what's happening at the aggregate level. Lastly, also, there might be tendencies to be biased. Some of the experts can be attached to a political system or organizations that they care about. But it's also true to any data collection, any key informant interviews or survey. But what is important is to explain to them what really that we are getting at. It's not an evaluation of their effort, it's not an evaluation of their organization, but it's just their perspective. And one way also to do it is, again, diversify the sample and aggregate the data so that we can explain the aggregates. Next slide, please. So 23 of the 44 measurements based on perception question. It's 23 seems a lot, but it's actually because we are focusing on not just one policy, but several policies. We're looking at agriculture, nutrition, climate policy. It's just the nature of, like WEAGov that looks at the national agri-food policy. But there's really 7 perception, questions. One, for example, is, gender attention to prioritize, policy issues. Number 2, opportunities for women to provide inputs to agri-food policy processes. We've also, looked at women's inputs, women's perceived, influence in the policy process, their perception on budget adequacy, budgetary support, and implementation of the gender targets, efforts to hire women in the policy implementing agencies, and how they're tracking and monitoring gender goals in the policies that were identified. So in general, we have a 4-point Likert scale. WEAGov is consistent in its scoring. It's 4-point Likert scale. And it matches with the survey design also. So how we organize the options and the choices for each of the statements and questions, they have 4-point 4 things to select. They can select one out of the 4 choices. I'll give an example, here. And here, the example is a measurement of whether there are opportunities for women to provide inputs into policy process. So we ask 4 questions, right? Whether women, we ask them, next slide, please. I think it's better to see the sample questions. One question is to look at the agri-food policy issues. How salient is gender in these policy discussions, public speeches, parliamentary sessions, debates, high-level official speeches? Are women even mentioned in those? So one set of questions that we have is to ask them what are basically these policy issues related to agriculture that being talked about. So can you name one? So they can say fertilizer policy, food prices, input policy that's very high, input prices that are very high. So depending on their answer there, we ask a follow-up question. How often in the last 12 months do high-level government officials, address this, policy issues? So they can select 0 times, 1, 2, or 3 times, 4 times. 4 times could be equivalent of a quarterly, right? So for us, quarterly, that's already good, right? Maybe less than that might be less frequent, but for quarterly might be ideal. And then from there, we ask another follow-up question, pointing to whether gender or women's issues are featured every time they mention about an important policy issue in the agriculture sector by these high-level officials. Next slide, please. So that's just give you a flavor of what are these types of questions that we include in our survey. The second one is this question on whether there are opportunities for women to provide inputs. So we give a description, right, on what do we mean by input, what do we mean by voice, right? So usually in the questionnaire we give a description so that it avoids ambiguity in the responses. And then we say, to what extent do citizens in general have opportunities to provide inputs into the agricultural policy formulation? Then they can select whether citizens have few opportunities, limited opportunities, some opportunities, or there are many opportunities, but actually citizens often do not know how to navigate these opportunities. So that will be a score 3. The ideal one is that there are many opportunities out there for citizens to provide inputs, and citizens know about them and they use this processes to provide inputs. So we also changed it and added more questions so that it is more specific to women. So instead of asking to what extent do citizens have opportunities to provide inputs, we ask women specifically, to what extent do women specifically have opportunities to provide inputs? And also from the perspective of intersectionality, we ask questions such as, do women specifically in lower economic and social status and marginalized groups have the opportunity to provide, inputs? So those are the type of, questions that we ask there. Again, we can, share the survey instruments. You can have a look at them. As I've said, it's a rich survey instrument that looks at many different studies, many different researches that looks at this complex issue of governance, of voice, and policy processes. We've gathered those survey instruments that they have, and then catered it to WEAGov. So this could be considered as a good, practice that tries to integrate what's out there, the state of the art in terms of asking these questions, investigating, and doing this assessment on this topic. Next slide, please. I think we can go. So these are just one illustration of how we use those survey questions and how they translate them into scores. So the issue of opportunities for women's input in the policy process, we asked 4 questions, right? And then the graph here shows the frequency or the percentage of the sample experts and their answers. You can see here that the second option, citizens have limited opportunities to provide inputs in the agri-food policy formulation, that's the most common. That's the one that was the most often, cited or reported. So we take the most common and then use that as a score for WEAGov. And it applies to several of the perception, questions. We're looking at, what the most common response of the sample, experts, and then think of that as, the most likely, scenario that then describes the status of that particular measure or indicator that we are assessing, and then take that as a score. So it's consistent across 23 of our perception questions. Next slide, Jordan, I think we can go to the very end. These are just more examples. We can go at the very end of the presentation. Go to the very end of the one more. Great. This one. So I'll go back to this one. How WEAGov is or can be used, right? This is, one of the few major slides of Jordan at the beginning, and I want to re-emphasize it. So WEAGov really has 3 value proposition, 3 contribution. One is the conceptual framework, right? The 3x3 conceptual framing and matrix that you can use in your innovation policy project. You can apply it to any policy. You can apply it to any topic or any subsector that you are assessing and you want to work on. So that's one. You can use that conceptual framework. Number 2, you can use the full WEAGov, the one that I just presented, that has all this metric, this measurement, this 11 indicators and 44 measurements. If you are interested and your project deals with national level or state level agri-food policy processes, because that tool can help identify what are the bottlenecks, what are the entry points, and what are the gaps. And you can track progress over time because you did the scoring, right? You can, say, oh, in 2024, it was red, right? We want that in 3 years, 5 years, some of those reds could be orange or could be yellow or could be green. So that's the contribution, that's the value proposition of doing the scoring and doing that full metrics WEAGov at the national level policy processes. The third one, even though you don't use the full WEAGov measurement tool, right? For example, you're just focusing on a specific topic, you don't have to do the national level policy process. The WEAGov can still be a useful tool in terms of the resources, in terms of the survey instruments and the measurement tools that you can use for your own research. Last slide. Great. That's basically our last slide. Jordan, you can, before we go here, do you want to show the very last slide on just our slide on the resources? You can find out more about WEAGov. We have a website, we have the infographics, you have already the QR code. explore it. If you have questions, you can reach out to us. Whether you're planning on using the WEAGov fully or parts of it, reach out to us. You have our email addresses. And one last thing, we are also in the last stages of finalizing our toolkit or a guidance note that will give you the details that one would need to implement the full WEAGov and the different aspects of it if you just are interested in looking at some parts of it. So it's coming out soon. Hopefully in 1 or 2 months it will be out. Go back to that next slide, Jordan, for our poll. But basically, that's what we have to offer as an overview, a very quick snapshot of what WEAGov can do and what are the measurement tools, indicators, and how you would collect the data. Over to you, Jordan.
Thank you so much for walking us through all that material, Catherine, and thank you to all of you for hanging with us. I know that that's a lot to absorb in a short period of time. Really, we wanted to give you that overview so you could see what is available that you can take a deep dive on and draw from. So I'm hoping you can answer our last poll today to kind of give us an indication of what you found most useful. That will help us kind of refine and think about what tools we need to, put out publicly. We really appreciate that feedback. And then, we're happy to take questions now. I know we only have a few minutes left in the seminar, but if you have questions, we're happy to address.
So maybe, Jordan, we can start with the questions in the Q&A, even as we give them time to respond to the poll. There's some 2 questions in the Q&A. Shall I read them out to you?
Yes, please. Thank you. Yeah, I have my screen in presentation mode, so I can't see them.
Let me read that. So a question from Mami Rajauna Riso, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, would be interested to know about the time to get through the whole process of the WEAGov for Nigeria and India. And then she's also asking about the budget needed to do the whole analysis and our government's asking and financing for it.
Ooh, those are 3 really good and practical questions. I guess I'll say, first, I think the Nigeria and India were very difficult countries to start in for WEAGov, in the sense that they're huge federal countries where a lot of policies implemented at the state level. And so, one thing that kind of took both additional time and resources was ensuring that we could incorporate the perspective of state level actors in addition to those, who work in the capital city. So the Nigeria pilot took like 6 to 8 weeks at the time that we started implementing it. And Catherine, please correct me if I'm misremembering it, because it's been a while since we implemented the survey. But there was quite a lot of legwork by our local research partner, the Agricultural Policy Research Network, based in Nigeria, in terms of, reaching out to experts and organizations in advance, telling them about the project, walking them through what the survey would be like, getting their consent, and then kind of, starting the project. And so I think that initial legwork that they did was really, really critical. The pilot in India took quite a bit longer because we were also implementing it, coming up to India's big election that they just held. And so there were many sort of experts, especially in the public sector, who wanted to wait until kind of after the election to engage in the project, or who sort of wanted to see what the election results would be in terms of maybe changing women's leadership or some of the policy dynamics to answer the survey, and getting to the state level our local partners were quite ambitious in India in terms of the number of states that they wanted to engage with. So that one took it's still ongoing, but it probably took closer to 3 or 4 months, I'd say, end to end, by the time we'd like engaged actors, done desk review, and conducted the validation workshop. Catherine, do you want to come in on some of the
That's very true.
questions
Yeah,
too?
very true, Jordan. Yeah. So for Nigeria, around 2 to 4 weeks, right? So the idea is basically, doing it simultaneously, right? So it depends. If you have a team that would be doing the survey or interviews in Bauchi, for example, it can be done simultaneously in Adamawa. So it depends, how you structure it, but it could be, you could do it in a fast way. You can do it also in a slower, way. And bear in mind also that these are pilots. These are our first time to do it. So it's really, it took a little bit longer. So Nigeria, 2 to 4 weeks. In India, because of the election, like what Jordan said, it took 2 to 3 months to do it. Yeah. So in terms of timeline and in terms of budget, again, it depends on the topic that you will be working on. But basically the time really is to a lot of time is in designing the organizational and expert survey, right? And looking at documentation. So this is not household survey. So we have designed WEAGov to be cost effective in relation, for example, to sampling large sample at the household or community level. These are expert level. So it's smaller, sample size. It's more cost, effective. In Nigeria and India, think of it as around 20,000 to do that expert, survey and organizational survey. It's bigger because it's a national level and it looks at all of the policies on agriculture, nutrition, and climate. So if you're doing a subsector or a specific policy, right, fewer samples, you can downsize it. But that's just a figure that we spend looking at the big national level agri-food system in Nigeria and Ghana. Desk review, you don't need too many human resources to do it, right? You can do it. You can hire some help to analyze the policy documents, to do the desk review, and do some research on available documentation and evidence. So we really designed WEAGov so that it's easily replicated. You can use it, others can use it. We provide those advice and the tools that you can use in terms of survey questionnaires so that you don't have to start from scratch. You can just adapt it, a little adaptation to whatever you're doing. We give advice on the scoring that you can do, right? Or some questions where you can get more insights, qualitative insights, as a deep dive approach. So you should be able to replicate it in your particular context. So those are the figures that we spent and the time that was involved looking at it from a national big level perspective. Other questions? I think there's one more question, or I think we're over time. Now, Susan or Doreen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Catherine and Jordan. Yes, we are running out of time, so I'd like just to ask for 5 minutes because I'd like to call, and then there are other questions, but unfortunately we've run out of time to engage with them. But maybe what we will do, and maybe Margaret can respond to this when she comes on board, we can collate all these questions and see how to organize follow-up sessions later. But I'd like to invite Dr. Margaret Mangeni, the Senior Programs Manager for Gender and Research at Award, to just come in and give the closing remarks, and then we can and tell us about the next steps. But I would like to thank all of you very much for a wonderful session that we've had. We've had people really staying with us until this time. But Margaret, please come in.
Thank you so much, Doreen. The names are Margaret Najingo Mangeni. I haven't interacted with some of you, but happy to be part of this process. And I'm going to say two things. The first is thanks, and then lastly, way forward. In terms of thanks, we are so grateful to Catherine, Jordan, and the partners that are behind this very, very important tool for spending time with our GRASP community to share with us. Thank you so much. Doreen, thank you for moderating this session. Our director, Susan, who gave us those very inspiring remarks at the beginning to set the stage. The organizers, the staff of our ward who have worked behind this initiative, thank you. And the entire GRASP community, thank you for staying with us all the time. This is very, very important. It's very strategic for Africa. What we are doing is critical. So we are so grateful as a ward that we are part of the leadership spearheading transformation of Africa through this agri-food systems policy space. Way forward, many of you have reacted in the chat that you want the presentation. Yes, the presentation will be available. The recording will be available. We realize that there is a lot of information that has been given to us, but it takes time to digest it. So therefore, we shall be sharing all these. And thank you, Catherine Jordan, for sharing the link. Yeah. We've had 2 cohorts in the room. There is cohort 1. They're already at the stage of implementing their PIPs. We hope that you picked important ideas that you want to take forward. So for you, we will actually get in touch and hear from you. How do you plan to use WEAGov in your ongoing work? And based on that, we shall organize follow-up webinars and other support that will help you operationalize, adapt to what we have had today. For cohort 2, maybe many of these were new terms, you don't understand them, you've not covered the gender in food policy systems course. You are going to get the course and it will be where you will be able to understand the definition, the concept. And therefore for you, you start with this tool in mind as you conceptualize, you design, you implement your PIP. So the course will be the next step for you. And for all of us, really is to go to the website, to read, to engage, to ask questions, and attend the subsequent webinars that we shall have. Thank you so much, Catherine, Jordan. Definitely award the GRASP community will be at your door again to take this very, very exciting journey of learning forward, application, publishing, influencing, engaging for action and transformation. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Margaret. Yeah. All right, and with that, we bring the session to a close. Wishing you the very best for the rest of your day, for Catherine and Jordan, and for those of us in Kenya and Eastern Africa, the end of the day. So have a wonderful evening and have a good one, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Interesting. Indeed.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Very inclusive.